So I have had the really fascinating opportunity to be inside the human body thousands of times and be inside human heart arteries thousands of times by angiography and now more and more by CT scanning, and they really are a beautiful thing. I mean, part of making a decision to be healthy is understanding what good health feels like. I mean, it feels really good as I approach my 61st birthday. Never spent a night in the hospital other than as a resident, never had an operation, and take no prescription drugs. It's really, really good to feel healthy. But it's also good to actually see what healthy looks like, because heart disease is sadly a very silent, very quiet, progressive problem. And you can't see it much on the outside. You can see a few little clues on the outside, but not much. And these are just these beautiful channels. Maybe you know this. There's 50,000 miles of arteries in the body. You know, around the world there's 24,000 miles. We can go twice around the world. That's how many arteries we have. You probably know the word, not a very common word, the endothelium, because it's a favorite of Dr. Esselstyn and favorite of the Nobel Prize Committee in 1989 when there was enough science to award 3 researchers data. But in those arteries, there's like a single layer of wallpaper, 1 cell thin, that is the endothelium. If you were to take it all out, it would fill 7 or 8 tennis courts of tissue. Think about how big that is, maybe a high school tennis court, complex. It's actually perhaps the biggest organ in the body in terms of its function. Makes that wonderful, wonderful little chemical called nitric oxide and many other helpful and damaging chemicals. I mean, if you had only one thing in life, said, I'm going to lead a life that helps my endothelium stay healthy, you'd have great blood pressure, you'd have great brain function, you'd have great heart function, you'd have great sexual function. And what you're doing is actually making your endothelium healthy when you're at this conference and enjoying the excellent food and the education. Just get up and move around a little. I'm a very bad sitter. I don't sit. I think I'm allergic to it. A couple more. Oh, there we go. There's that, those blue arrows pointing to that single layer of cells, the endothelium. We know it's there. It's a little hard to test how healthy the endothelium is. Hopefully I don't see any young children. If a man is able to have a solid sexual response, your endothelium is working to some extent. If your blood pressure is normal, you probably got a healthy endothelium. But there are blood tests. There are some other non-invasive tests that actually Dr. Katz mentioned a bit on his panel last night that he's done studies on, I've done studies on. But it's a tricky little thing to see it. So value your arteries, value your endothelium. Just in case you're not an invasive cardiologist, I don't think there's another in the room, but if there is, I welcome you. That's what an angiogram looks like when you've taken good care of your body and maybe also have had good genetics. Beautiful, clean, branching arteries, rushing all the blood you need to any organ in your body. Again, 50,000 miles. But we can mess it up, and genetics can mess it up. We mess it up more than genetics mess it up, though, as we'll talk about. And there's the problem. I mean, these are pathology slides that you're probably not routinely looking at. But that is a cross-section through the artery that previously looked like a big open channel or a big open pipe if you're in the plumbing industry. And you can see now it's all full of stuff except for that little narrowing. We're competing with the slot car people, and apparently there's an emergency for the Camaro group. But you can see how small that little opening is. If that artery is going to your leg and you're walking upstairs, your calf is probably going to ache, called claudication, or peripheral arterial disease. If that artery is going to your heart, you might get breathless playing tennis or get a little tightness in your chest or flunk a treadmill stress test if there's a reason to do it. If that was going to your carotid artery to your brain, you might have a little visual impairment or speech impairment, a little TIA mini stroke. And if it's going to your pelvis, you might not find any response with amorous activities or even to the famous blue pill. So we do a pretty good job of messing these things up. That's just one more. That is not a happy smile. That is an artery that used to be wide open, and there's all kinds of things in there. One thing that's not in there, there is no sugar in there. You can't determine under the microscope any sucrose or glucose or fructose or ribose. There are a lot of cells, white blood cells. You've heard the word inflammation. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about inflammation in a few minutes. There are a lot of white blood cells, macrophages and monocytes and stuff. There's calcium. Some of you are aware there is a CT scan, CAT scan you can do that can tell you if your arteries are aging or not. If you don't know that already from a previous heart attack or bypass, it detects the calcium that would be in an artery like that and gives you a gauge to your true age inside. There actually are crystals. Crystals aren't only salt crystals we might put in the house for better karma. There are actually somewhat dangerous cholesterol crystals inside these kind of badly diseased arteries. One of the theories is that on the day you convert from being a seemingly healthy person to having a heart attack within a few minutes or an hour of the onset of feeling poorly, these little crystals, these sharp crystals, much like the crystals in a gout toe, if some of you have had gout, know how horrible that is, these little crystals actually can puncture through the lining of that artery and cause a blood clot to finish the horrible act off. But I do want to just back up what I just said. There is cholesterol in these plaques. There isn't sugar in these plaques. I'm no fan, and I'm not recommending you rush out and go to the restaurant, get all the white sugar packs, and take them home as a health move. Don't do that. But there is cholesterol in the plaque. It's a constant constituent, and it wasn't there at one point, and it got there. The only way it can get there is from the bloodstream. And therefore, just intuitively, the amount of cholesterol in your blood might relate to the amount of cholesterol plaque you develop. And we'll go through that. Does cholesterol matter was the title. So that's an important concept. For 102 years, heart disease has been the #1 cause of death in the United States. It actually began in 1918. There were still more heart deaths in 1918 than flu deaths. And every year since, there is a little competition going on with cancer rivaling heart deaths. In a couple states, it slightly exceeds it, but as a total country, heart deaths are still #1, cancer #2, and often the next thing put down there is something like emphysema, chronic lung disease. That's not an entirely true and honest list that's often put out. This is from the American Heart Association, because if you look at that pink box, you can see the biggest circle is heart disease, the second biggest circle is cancer. But according to studies at Johns Hopkins University and other locations, actually being in a hospital and being a patient is the third leading cause of death, medical errors. Rather frightening idea, the wrong drug, the wrong blood transfusion, the wrong operation, the bed sore, the infection that doesn't respond to antibiotics. It's a real deal. I'm a frequent reviewer of medical charts to assist attorneys in defense or other such matters in the court. And the number, in fact, last night and this morning, I was finishing a report about the inadvertent administration of a drug dose to a young woman 10 times higher than was supposed to occur, and it caused a heart attack. This stuff really does happen. A very important clue there is not to depress you on that topic, but be healthy so you don't need a hospital very often. You know, visit other people and be kind and get the heck out of there and don't eat in a hospital. But if you can design a life where, you need a medical team, but hopefully it's a rare and outpatient experience, you have the best chance of avoiding the third leading cause of death in the United States. Quite an amazing statistic, actually. So why do we clog our arteries? How do we go from 50,000 miles of beautiful pathways, clean, healthy endothelium, no cholesterol crystals inside the arteries, no accumulation of white blood cells and fibrous tissue, to the fact that by age 40, 50, 60, 70, and certainly beyond, it is the predominant cause of disability and death? What the heck is happening to us? Well, if you look at just, you can learn from different ways. You can learn from basic biochemistry. You can learn from epidemiology. You can learn from the holy clinical trials. But there was a rise in the number of cases and deaths from heart disease that was noted. It's a disease that's been around. In fact, there have been a number of studies in the last decade of mummies. Can you imagine a research project where you take an Egyptian mummy to a hospital and you do a CT scan to identify that the blood vessels are calcified in age? And they are. There was, anybody know who Otzi the Iceman was? You guys know? Otzi the Iceman was a Neanderthal wanderer who fell in a crack 5,000 years ago in Europe and was frozen intact with his body preserved as well or better than any other 5,000-year-old, other than George Burns to his last few days. And at any rate, Otzi has been the source of many, many studies. He's been written up in Scientific American. It's OTZI if you have any interest. It is pretty fascinating. But Otzi, the Iceman's arteries, are quite involved with atherosclerosis. They actually did gene studies on Otzi, the Iceman of all things, and he inherited a gene called 9p21 from his mom and dad, Mr. and Mrs. Otzi. And I don't know exactly the rest of his diet and such. I believe he died with either an arrow or a blade, so he was a traumatic death. Not of a heart attack, but he died with heart disease. So the disease has been around, but World War II in the United States, when it ended, was a joyful time, I'm told. I'm not quite able to recall anything till 1959, and I came into this world, crying, screaming, and kicking. But the late 40s and early 50s, the grand time of 50% of America smoking, and food supply and food companies like Kraft really starting to develop options for us. There was a big spike in heart attacks. A lot of it was male. Females get a little advantage on average till post-menopause. And there were a lot of people dropping dead. That prompted an evaluation. Why do people have heart attacks? That's why the government started funding something called the Framingham Heart Study. You may have heard of that outside of Boston. 1948, right after World War II, they had to answer the question. When Eisenhower had his big heart attack in 1955, it prompted even more funding and questioning, why do people have heart disease and heart attacks? It really wasn't well known. The general concept was it's just a disease of age, your arteries clog up, but indeed there are people I take care of in their late 80s, early 90s that have no detectable atherosclerosis. It's not inevitable. There are famous examples like Mr. Nathan Pritikin, who ran the Pritikin Center and for majority of his adult life ate a very healthy diet and had a lot of fitness and good lifestyle, who had autopsy at his request, had super clean arteries. So there are examples of it, but this spike prompted us to dive deep. And as I said, if you drive outside Boston, you can go visit the town that changed America's heart, because there was funding, and that's 1948 that it started. The Adventist Health Study was funded in 1958. So it was by the 1960s that we started to get some clues, of which cholesterol was one of the clues. And you can see the Framingham study began. The term risk factor, you've probably heard that. You know, risk factor is really important, actually, just so you know. Even in your conversation with your friends, family, peers, you know, smoking is a risk factor for lung cancer and heart disease. But there are some smokers over 100 that have never developed those diseases clinically. A high cholesterol, we'll talk about, is a risk factor. It's not the risk factor, and that's a subtle but important. High cholesterol is a risk factor. There are people with a cholesterol 325 that don't apparently have clogged arteries, and there are people with a cholesterol 150 that don't haven't avoided clogged arteries. It's part of an equation I'll talk to you about. But it is statistically, and for you, I mean, not wearing a seatbelt is a risk factor for dying in a car accident. Now, hopefully you'll never have a car accident, and you could go through life without your seatbelt on. But it's a wise, decision to pay attention to risk factors. And then they keep on doing and publishing and following. They're actually still following the grandchildren of the original Framingham participants as to their health. And we've learned a lot. It's not perfect, but we've learned, the issue that if you know risk factors, if you know that the person having bypass probably had an issue with their blood pressure, blood sugar, cholesterol, smoking, fitness, genetics, why don't we pay attention to people 10 or 15 years earlier, turn the sink off, turn the things that drive disease off, and then we don't have to crack your chest and put in stents and operate on your leg arteries and take blue pills for things that should happen naturally during our life. Turn the faucet off. This is a slide, if you've not seen very often, used by Dr. Dean Ornish, but it's also sometimes credited, if you know the name, Dennis Burkitt, who was the physician from England who spent a lot of time in Africa. He's often considered the king of fiber. He thought if we all just ate more fiber, and I can assure you there's no fiber in chicken or beef or pork or eggs. If we ate more fiber, we'd turn off the faucet of a lot of chronic diseases, and we still believe that. Does cholesterol, does saturated fat and such have a relationship with heart disease? Well, how do we know it? Well, here's the data. This is the research project of Dr. Ansel Keys and 17 other scientists around the world, called the 7-country study, begun in 1958, officially published in 1970, but they kept on accumulating data. This is 25-year data. This is your risk of dying of heart disease, like a heart attack, and it's the amount of saturated fat in your diet. Now, you and I just had a bowl of delicious breakfast. It didn't tell us saturated fat, but you didn't see butter on it, so that's good. You didn't see cheese on it, that's good. You didn't see red meat on it, that's good. You didn't see coconut oil all over it, which from a saturated fat intake is good. Plant diets tend to be very low in saturated fat unless you are a big user of coconut and palm oil. So if you look over there way to your left, like tea, that's Japan. The Japanese, that's specifically, I think it was Okinawa, a very low natural content of saturated fat in their diet. They eat a little bit of fish. I think it's about 3% of their calories come from animal products in the 1960s when these people were being followed. And if you go way to your right, that high point E, not very high for health, E is Finland. E is something we talked about in the panel last night, North Karelia. If you love butter and you love sausage, you're living in North Karelia, Finland. The amount of calories you're getting from saturated fat alone is a quarter of all calories, and you can see the rate of heart disease and follow-up is enormous. Now, these are called associations. The critics will say, those that love their butter and their sausage from a scientific standpoint, maybe the people in Finland, point E, smoke more, sit around more, stress more, maybe the water's hard or the water's soft. You know, there's a lot of variables you could throw in. And maybe the people in Japan, letter T, you know, are more fit and have more community, have more faith, some other factor that relates to heart disease. But these studies do something that scientists call multivariate analysis. You know how many of these people are diabetic, are smokers, are on high blood pressure medicines. All those things are factored out before a graph like this is made. So it's an attempt to isolate alone saturated fat and its relationship to heart disease. And you can see, if you've seen the Game Changers, you saw something like this. And I've handled enough blood in tubes. This is real. But if you look way to the left, after your morning breakfast, assuming you didn't rush out and pour coconut oil all over it, your blood, if spun down, would be, you know, motor engine oil clear. This is what we have in common with the slot car people in the next room. And if you ate at the lobby restaurant and you had some sausage link and a cheese omelet, your blood would look foamy and white and thicker and much more prone to clot and much more prone to carry a high amount of cholesterol in it. And that's blood. What does blood travel in? It travels in arteries. And it is possible for that cholesterol to transfer across that holy endothelium and enter into the wall of the artery and stay there for a very long time, your entire life, and develop plaque. In terms of cholesterol itself, this is blood cholesterol, same study, Dr. Ansel Keys. This is really how we learned it. 25-year follow-up, your risk of dying of a heart attack and other heart-related illness based on how high your blood cholesterol is. And that is where we have gained much information to believe that, yes, it does matter what your cholesterol is in your blood. It's a risk factor. But if you look over there, cholesterol is over 300. Unfortunately, were reasonably common in the United States in the 1960s, and were very common, again, in Northern Europe, particularly Finland. And blood cholesterol is way down there in the 120s, 130s. These are not drug studies. These are just either differences in genes, that's one aspect, or differences in the environment and the diet. And most studies have shown it's not the genes particularly, because when people move from Serbia or Japan to communities, or we don't even have to move anymore. We brought the KFCs, the McDonald's to Serbia and Japan. The diet changes, the blood cholesterol goes up, and the heart disease will follow a decade or 2 decades later. So does cholesterol matter? Yes. Now, is there somebody in Northern Europe with a cholesterol 330 that's 98 years old and playing cards? There is, because it's a risk factor. But if you're a betting person, you're going to bet and say, I want to know my numbers, and maybe it'd be better if they were more like Serbia than like Northern Europe. But that was before studies were done. And I alluded to, but specifically, something that's been mentioned a couple times. Ni is a community in Japan, Han is Honolulu, and San is San Francisco. These were men studied by Dr. Ansel Keys and other members of his research team. What your blood cholesterol is, what's your blood pressure, what's your presence of heart disease, living in your native Japan diet and the entire environment. Yeah, let's pick up and move the family to Hawaii. We want some beach time and some American lifestyle. And then let's move to San Francisco. Of course, these were just observations. These people moved on their own. But their surroundings changed. Their genes didn't change within this relatively short time. So it showed that the Japanese living in Japan, lowest cholesterol, very low heart death rates. As they moved to Hawaii, they got to a middle ground. As they moved to San Francisco, welcome to America, the land of abundance, and the land of abundant cholesterol. So if you look even just to the left, blood cholesterol levels in Japan are in white, in Honolulu are in black. We started to add in a couple hamburgers, a couple fries down the street on the Waikiki Beach. But then you get to San Francisco and you got the whole spectrum of American food and stress and pollution. It's food mainly, but there are other factors. And all of a sudden your cholesterol's up and your risk of heart deaths are up. Pretty striking data that, again, genes matter, but your decision what you eat, which isn't entirely dependent on what city you live in anymore, because we've exported Western diets everywhere. There's a lot of data on this slide. I'm not here to tell you go get a prescription for Lipitor or not. That's something you discuss with your doctor. I am telling you eat a diet that naturally favors a low blood cholesterol, which is a low saturated fat diet, which is basically the plant diets we're eating here, and hopefully you're doing at home. But this European Society of Cardiology has finally come around to teach what some of us, and including myself, have been practicing in the clinic. If you go way to the lower right, the higher your risk of dying of heart disease, the more intensive therapy you need, and the lower cholesterol you should try and achieve. So if you've had bypass, if you've had a stroke and a clogged artery that's been operated on, you're at high risk for things coming up. Sprouts may not do it alone. Try the sprouts, try the gym, try good sleep, try certainly to drop your weight to a healthy level. And if you go way up on the left to a low-risk person, how do you know you're low risk? Well, it's the traditional things. I don't smoke. My blood pressure is great. My blood sugar is great. My cholesterol is 140. I don't have any mom, dad, brother, sister with a heart attack or stroke at age 38. I sleep at night. My waistline's thin. But you can also actually check your arteries by an ultrasound or a CT scan of the heart. That's a different talk. But if you're very low, you don't need prescription drugs. That was actually a fairly radical thought in mainstream medicine 5 years ago, but even our American Heart Association now says many people taking Lipitor-style drugs actually are so low risk they don't need them. But you have to check. You have to actually calculate or look at an artery and all. So we are making progress. Now, would it be a good idea for everybody on this spectrum to eat a whole food, plant-based, naturally low saturated fat diet? Absolutely. And in most cases, the written material is to introduce lifestyle changes before you start a prescription drug. In reality, that often is glossed over in clinical practice, unfortunately. All right, so lesson number one for everybody is for you and your relatives and children, if you have, check your cholesterol early and repeat it now and then. It can change. It can change for the better because this conference or last year's conference or the Game Changers has spurred you to even upgrade your diet more, or it can change for the worse because health issues have come in, or the holiday season was a tough cookie period, and for a lot of people that I speak to in my clinic, that is a tough period. The weight goes up and the willpower goes down. But I do want to turn for the talk that does cholesterol matter? It does, but it's not the only thing that matters, and it is a risk factor. It's not absolutely determinant. So this scary picture is supposed to be an artery full of plaque with all those steak knives. I usually call them daggers, but let's call them steak knives. And each of them, if you could read it, is a different chemical in the blood that could potentially precipitate clogged arteries. I'm not going to go through every one of them, but I want to tell you about a couple of them that are there or should be there, and upgrade your knowledge about what causes clogged arteries so you can have a couple practical points when you leave and take care of that. And some of them respond to eating well. Some of them don't respond to eating well, even more frustrating. So I did point out in one of those slides of heart arteries, that there were white blood cells in the plaque. White blood cells is basically a fancy word for pus, and you think about that as an infection. You've got a infected wound and it's draining. Well, that very process, we don't call them artery pimples. I have heard people speak of it as that, but it is the same process. It is inflammation. The middle word is flame. You need a system that responds with inflammatory warriors when you are exposed to pneumonia, hopefully not exposed to the coronavirus, exposed to a scab on your knee, and you want to have some defense mechanism to clean it up. Even with a gout attack, you want the white cells to come in and try and control the situation, but it can go awry. And many of us, unfortunately, don't have pneumonia and we don't have a gout attack, but if we did the right blood tests, we are suffering from excess inflammation. It's a lab situation that can be measured. Now, of course, you might feel inflamed. You all know what that feels like, joints and fingers and swelling. But when it transitions from acute, almost appropriate inflammation, illness, to every day of your life being determined you have inflammation. Now, I do a very extensive panel of blood work on my patients that measures 7 different ways to assess inflammation of blood vessels, and a lot of people are walking around with that. Why is that the case? Before we go there, it says appropriately, chronic inflammation is felt to be one of the fundamental root causes. If you want to turn the sink off, you've got to assess and control inflammation. It may be your dental health isn't optimal. You may have a root canal from 30 years ago that has a silent hidden infection causing some sinus problem and it's not resolving. That's an example. Could be your waistline is 4, 5, 6 inches too large because we know that the fat around the waist, the visceral fat, is more pro-inflammatory than having a little bit under your arms. Whatever you like physically, it's just the truth physiologically. You might be eating food that is inflammatory, which would be processed food. You like your Subway sandwiches or too much sugar in your soda pops. Those can be all inflammatory. Bad interrupted sleep, particularly sleep apnea. Do you snore? Do you breathe? You can easily get checked for sleep apnea now at home, and correcting sleep apnea can help you lose some weight and can help control inflammation. You might have a nutritional deficiency. We've talked a lot at this conference about DHA, EPA, omega-3 foods, omega-3 supplements, good, bad, recommended or not, vitamin D. But sometimes severe deficiencies, which are very common, and finally focusing, I'm going to actually get my 2 tablespoons a day of ground flaxseed or chia seeds, or emphasize walnuts over other nuts that aren't as rich in precursors of omega-3 and such. All those things matter. I go through that with everybody in my clinic, and we can correct a lot of it. It's not a new concept. This handsome man 160 years ago recognized that one of the factors of developing clogged arteries, atherogenesis, the beginning of plaque, is inflammation. It's white cells responding to cholesterol and these crystals entering into the artery through the wall, through the endothelium, and the white cells participate trying to control it, but they become part of the problem. It's called macrophages. So without too much detail, as we go from cleaner arteries on your left to plaque-involved arteries on your right, and then if you look carefully, you can see something that looks like a volcano exploding. It says plaque rupture in little letters away to your right. That's what we believe happens in the moments of a heart attack and stroke very often, that the lining that keeps the bad guys, the LDL, the oxidized LDL, the white cells away from the blood, that the lining could get thin and open up like the top of a volcano. All of a sudden you got a blood clot. But white cells are all over that situation. You want to know and control inflammation. So this was actually just as cholesterol was a theory, but now you saw a slide that says LDL cholesterol causes atherosclerosis. We don't think it's a theory anymore. It took decades. The idea that inflammation causes atherosclerosis, heart attacks, and strokes was a theory that really has been promoted mainly in the last 20 years by this gentleman, an esteemed Harvard professor who was involved in developing a blood test you may know of called high sensitivity C-reactive protein. I like to tell little side stories. Harvard owns the patent for this blood test that I've probably drawn 15,000 times on patients, high sensitivity C-reactive protein. Your doctor could do it. It's in every lab. You can pay and get it drawn on yourself if you go to a lab like lifeextension.com and some of the others online, wellnessfx.com. But I understand that Dr. Ridker doesn't profit from the patent. It actually goes to support a dog rescue shelter in Boston. If you want a warm fuzzy in your heart, I hope, I've read that, I hope it's true. I've met Dr. Ridker, and we share almost the exact same birth date. But I didn't actually pin him down to say, is that actually true? That is such a nice story. So Dr. Ridker developed a study, this is like his life work, inflammation, heart disease, to ask the question, is it really true that this low-grade inflammation from your poor dental health, from your poor diet, from your excess weight, from your poor sleep, from your sedentary lifestyle, from your processed food and sugar-rich foods and trans fats, which have largely been eliminated from the diet, does this really, really work? Can we prove it? And although what I'm going to show you is the data from a study of 10,000 people that was accomplished and presented a couple years ago, it's still kind of a hot topic. The drug that was tested, this wasn't a let's eat green juice study, let's go to Hippocrates Health Institute study, it wasn't that, it was a drug, is not going to be available for this purpose, even though the study was quite powerful. So we know about inflammation in our hands. Without boring you, if you look at the liver, which is in the middle at the bottom, you can see a little word there, CRP, and all. The liver puts out this chemical you can measure in the blood, high sensitivity C-reactive protein. But Dr. Ridker knows this whole pathway. How do you get C-reactive protein elevated in your blood? And they found a drug that a little higher up in the pathway blocks the process. And by blocking the process, it lowers C-reactive protein. And they took 10,000 people to ask the question, is that going to make a difference in their heart attack rate if we lower the C-reactive protein? So the drug won't be coming out. It's several $100,000 a year. There were side effects of infection rates. But in the people that were on the drug, their C-reactive protein dropped, and the risk, MACE is major adverse cardiac events. The risk of heart attack, stroke, need for bypass and such did go down. That's why the lines here aren't the same. One line was placebo. The lower line was the treated group. You can see the name of the drug. I can't pronounce it, canakinumab. But at any rate, this very expensive study proved the point. You should care about your inflammation. You should measure your inflammation. You should know your inflammation. It turns out, to give you great hope, that there is a diet-based study in heart patients that has been published in 2018. The EVADE coronary artery disease trial asked the question, you've got heart disease, you get put on a whole food plant diet for a year, you get put on a standard American Heart Association diet for the same period of time. Can we lower your C-reactive protein? Now, a whole food plant-based diet doesn't cost hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. It doesn't make you prone to sepsis and such matters, and it's something we can embrace much more. I exaggerated because it was an 8-week study, not a year study, but 100 patients randomized in this way, and the same blood test was the endpoint as was in that CANTOS high-profile study. People actually like their plant diets. 96% compliance at 4 weeks, 94%. They didn't send the food back. And when the results were published, you can see the American Heart Association diet on your right. The C-reactive protein before and after measured in the blood was about the same, but it did fall by 26%, which is actually not that far from how much it fell in that other major trial. Of course, this is only 8 weeks. We can't measure how many heart attacks, strokes, and bypasses in 8 weeks in 100 people. It takes a study like the other one of 10,000 people over about 4 years to get those numbers. So you are eating an anti-inflammatory diet every time you eat a sweet potato and a leafy salad and lupini beans or white beans or whatever is your favorite lentil and such. So you can reduce inflammation to reduce your risk of avoiding disease. And the practical point I'd suggest to you, if you've never had your HS, high sensitivity, C-reactive protein measured, you could ask your primary care doc to do it. It's a simple blood test. Every lab does it. If you want to do it outside the medical world, you can send away your blood to places like WellnessFX, lifeextension.com. I think there's a place now called anylab.now, and various places. It's not expensive, but eat a lot of plants.